Hey, thank you. So good morning. I'm Claire Champenois. I'm professor of entrepreneurship at Audencia. I'm also head of research of the Business and Society Department, which entails entrepreneurship. And in the name of the organizing committee of EAP4, I'm very happy to welcome you at Audencia for the 4th edition of the Entrepreneurship as Practice Conference. So welcome. You can see from the size of this room that the EAP community can grow. We have space for that, and we hope it will. You can come back in a few years. So we're going to spend 3 days together. Actually, we had a dream in Vegheux, as I recall in the program. Last year at EAP3, we imagined a very innovative structure for a research conference. In 3 blocks, so a structure that would enable newcomers to the field to really get a good feeling of what entrepreneurship as practice research is or can be. 1 day would be dedicated to theory, so what is or what are practice theories, what are the key concepts, the shared assumptions. 2nd day would be dedicated to methods. How do you concretely carry out practice-based study? How do you frame your research question? How do you design your research? How do you design your data collection? With what contributions? And a 3rd day, more classically dedicated to paper development sessions. And actually, we did it. So this is the structure of this year's conference, and we're very happy about it, very proud to have made it. Today will be dedicated to theory. It was conceived by Neil Thompson, who will talk with Bruce Teague about the fundamentals. We will also have brilliant speakers this afternoon with Malin Tilmar from LNU and Karen Verduin from VU Amsterdam, who's not here yet, on enacting resistance. We will also have Alistair Anderson from Lancaster University. Alistair is the editor of Entrepreneurship and Regional Development, which you all know, and he is also a very influential researcher in the EAP field. So we are very happy that he will talk about researching entrepreneurship practices. So this will be for today. Tomorrow we will work on methods. And so this was organized by Orla Byrne. I don't see Orla, but it's to introduce everyone. Thanks, Orla. And we were quite lucky to have the great support of Silvia Gherardi, who already joined. And Silvia was very generous of her time and accepted to give you 2 keynotes and to accompany these days, this methodological day, with 2 keynotes. And then on Friday, we will have the paper development sessions. This was organized by Bruce Teague here, and Richard Whittington from Oxford University Side Business School will be here as a keynote. And Richard is a leading scholar in the strategy as practice field. And so he will give us insights on SAP field and discuss it with the EAP community. We will also have PhD activities, and here again we're going to be very innovative. So this was organized by Miruna Radou-Lefebvre, Neil Thompson, and Vincent Lefebvre, who is up there, so you don't see him, but you will see him soon. So PhD activities will be run on the side. They're indicated in the program with the violin colors. So they run parallel to other sessions, which means they're only meant for PhD students. And every PhD student will meet with Vincent and will do a 5-minute pitch on their PhD work. This pitch will be recorded and then will be made available in the form of a podcast on the internet. Okay, so we will all be able to share your insights. So you see, we have a thrilling program. It was a teamwork. Bill Gardner was also quite involved in the whole organization, and Abby, who disappeared, Abidayao, whom you know, I think, for most of you through the emails. Abby was a great help and was my Mary Poppins. She solved every issue that needed to be solved. So I want to thank everybody for this teamwork and great achievements. What else? Oh, important information, dinner and food, because I got the advice last year from a member of the organizing committee that, you know, Claire, if you want to have a successful conference, one thing, you should have good food and booze. So, yeah, we organized that. We're going to have a lot of nice coffee breaks, lunches, and conference dinner tomorrow at Maison Baron Lefebvre. It's indicated in the program, in the enclosed piece of paper. Tonight is free. We haven't organized anything special, but we provide you with recommendations for good restaurants in Nantes. I would recommend that you book in advance because these are quite popular places. So if you want to have a table, you should do it this morning before noon. And now I think I let Bruce and Neil talk about the fundamentals of practice theory. I wish you all a very nice, enjoying, and rich conference. And we're here to help you if you need anything. Okay? See you soon. Bye-bye.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to kick off EAP4. It's been a really fun road to get down to the 4th annual conference. And I think we have a great program for the next 3 days, as Claire just talked about. So I'm going to get right into it. My name's Neil Thompson. I'm an assistant professor at the VU University in Amsterdam. I've been super interested in doing practice theory-oriented research in entrepreneurship for a few years now. And along with Bill, Bruce, Orla, Karen, and other people I need to mention, but I can't remember right now, have been trying to develop a community around developing theories of practice and entrepreneurship. A big barrier to doing that is this idea of practice theories. What are they? How is this different, et cetera? So we thought, building off last year, that it would be nice to kick off a session with a little bit about what is EAP. It's just so we're on the same level playing field. We have some similar kind of shared ideas. As great as that sounds, it's actually quite difficult to do in such a short amount of time because practice theory is quite a flexible concept. There's a lot of things that we can talk about that will need to be fleshed out in more conversation. But in any case, I've put together something to talk a little bit about EAP. And I have to also preface this a little bit that this is kind of my opinion about EAP. Not at all means that this is like absolute truth or anything like that, but there's definitely disagreements, and that's healthy, that's normal. But I'm just going to present my perspective, and we can keep talking about it. So, aim of this session, we're going to do two things. We're going to take a stock a little bit about what are the core elements and ideas of EAP, and also talk a little bit about how to move EAP forward. So some observations of mine for the past couple of years, and what are some opportunities, what are some challenges, and how to move things forward. All right. So what does EAP mean? Well, EAP means, I think, three things, or at least three things that mean differently to different people. And the first one is a call to arms. I'm going to explain these. A call to arms. The second one's a way of seeing entrepreneurial phenomena through the lens of practice. And the third is a new, stronger ontology. The level of commitment as you go down the stream increases. So the more that you go from 1 to 3, the more you really integrate theories of practice in your own research. So an agenda. In short, entrepreneurship practice is about studying the actual ing, the doing of entrepreneurship. So as a metaphor, dancing instead of the dancer. When we study ings, we can study real phenomena that are the doings. So these are really interesting things to look at that entrepreneurship scholars still struggle to conceptualize. We also practice theories are all social constructions or in the realm of social construction. So entrepreneurial phenomena is all socially constructed. This is a mentality that people share. So we see entrepreneurship as a building site, something that's built by people working together rather than a mental map or some kind of causal map. And the third one, as a call to arms, is a community of scholars, of what Bill says, readers and writers. And this is what we're here for in this conference, to develop our own writing abilities, research abilities, but as well as reading other people's work, giving feedback, and developing this space as a community. So if you wanted to put this in one way, with the ings of entrepreneurship, is moving a lot from nouns to verbs. Here's an example for resources. On the left, there's an article entitled Entrepreneurship, Subjectivism, and Resource View, so the resource-based view of entrepreneurship. In this view, fundamentally, resources are entities or something that people can own. They exist in the world out there, and people own them, and they use them, and they acquire them to do their entrepreneurial purposes. We all know this. We read these kinds of articles. This is not unusual. Resource-based views everywhere in entrepreneurship research. Practice theory perspective about resources is that resourcing is the topic of focus, because only when you consider what people are doing together, then you can understand what resources and what materials matter when and when other materials don't matter. So we get much more of a fine-grained view. This is an example from Susie Geiger's paper, Writing the Practice Waves, such that resources are only emergent in the resourcing practice itself, the specific practice, and meaning and use of resources are embedded in these relationships between people, actors, objects, and material things. So that was the first one. That's kind of the community of practice. This is the first step of engaging with practice theories. The second one I'd say is a little bit deeper, a little bit more of a commitment. The second commitment is a way of seeing all entrepreneurial phenomena through the lens of practice. So this is where we get into practice theories themselves. There's many types of practice theories we're well aware of. People are using different practice theories in their own research. Most commonly is Pierre Bourdieu's work, but there's many different types of practice theories. We have many available. We can definitely use all of these different types of practice theories in our own research, but I also strongly don't recommend trying to build your own practice theory. These are really long philosophical projects, not something that you make up on your own real quick. So I suggest that we stick with what kinds of practice theories we have already to really employ those. Next is an orientation towards explaining entrepreneurial phenomena, and really thinking about that phenomena as social orders, or what Goffman would call interaction order. Looking at those interaction orders, those real interaction orders, and trying to explain them in terms of practices. To take this step, you need to first adopt this ontology, this onto-epistemological framework of practice theories, or which one you're working with, and assume that phenomena can be explained in practices. So this means whatever you're interested in, whatever phenomena you're interested in, look at the practices and how they can explain your phenomena. Whether it's a collection of practices or one practice, really dig into those empirical practices and see how they can explain your phenomena. And the last one is focus on real situated performances, their effects and their historical conditions of possibility. And I think for entrepreneurship scholars, I put in parentheses, the careful of stereotyping practices beforehand. I think a danger for us, from my own experience, also this is a learning curve that I'm also going through, is trying to think off the top of my head in my office, okay, what practice do I want to study? I'm going to go after that, which is actually quite difficult because as an empirical reality, business modeling, for example, is made up of many practices that people are actually doing on the ground. And those things are interconnected to form something we call business modeling. To tackle this as a practice, a priori you get to the field, can be quite complicated and actually quite confusing before you get into the empirical field. So be very careful of trying to stereotype a practice before you actually engage. The learning curve for me has been to go into the field with an idea about what's interesting, actually seeing what's interesting, and then trying to explain that interesting bits by looking at the actual practices. So just keep going deeper into the phenomena. And the third one, which I need my notes for because it's more complicated, this is the strongest commitment you can make to bringing theories of practice into entrepreneurship. This is the strong ontology. So bringing in a strong ontology of practices is the idea that practice is all there is. Any social phenomenon, any sociological theory, any interaction order, there's only practices underneath. So no institutional theory, no critical realism, there's only practices. This is a very strong commitment. There's no cognitive mental maps, there's no social networks. Practices is the fundamental unit of actual human interaction, and those can explain larger phenomenon or any kind of social phenomenon. This is a very, as you can see, I'm trying to really stress this point, is that if you take an entrepreneurship as practice perspective and say I'm taking a strong ontology, a Schatzky ontology, there is nothing else but the practice plenum, this large entanglement of practices. So to explain your phenomenon, you need to research and understand those practices and not refer to something above them, like institutions, or below them, like cognitive systems or something like that. This also does away with levels. We in entrepreneurship scholars often talk about levels, hierarchical levels, individual level, organizational level, societal level. Practice theories, if you really adopt this strong ontology, does away with levels. Everything happens on the same plane, the plane of practice, and the entanglements of different practices. So you really have to be careful and ask yourself, how ready am I to jump into number 3? Is this something I really want to get into, the onto-epistemological approach of strong practice theory? Is this something I'm really ready to take on? It does take a certain amount of commitment, and also for me, I make kind of mistakes. I'm learning when I can and cannot reference certain things, so that's where we're at. Also, the last one I'll say is, there can be a bit of a wordplay here where you say I'm taking a Schatzian perspective to my phenomenon and your paper, and then the rest of the paper can be about something other than practices, which is incoherent according to this kind of ontology. So if you're going to cite Schatzky or you're going to cite a strong ontology of practice theories and then bring in something else in your paper as an explanatory factor, that is technically incoherent with taking a practice approach. So what are the challenges, benefits, opportunities of adopting all 3? I'm going to walk a little bit through those real quick. So benefits of adopting all 3 is 1 and 2 are growing. The community of practice around entrepreneurship, the idea that you can study practices is growing. We have a lot of, I do the website for EAP. We get a lot of new members emailing to try to add to the newsletter. There's a lot of interest. Special issues are underway, being published soon. Research handbooks are coming out. I'll talk more about that in a little while. Also within the academy, I'm also learning a little bit more about how this political game works within the academy to kind of carve out space for scholarship and how important that can be. In the academy itself, SAP has done a great job of championing practice theories throughout the academy, and entrepreneurship can be a part of that for sure. I think Richard will talk a bit about that probably. And it's also a bit subversive to the mainstream entrepreneurship research. I think this is a benefit, not a challenge. Well, it could be a challenge as well, of course, but I think this is interesting because fundamentally we don't look at the entrepreneur. We don't equate entrepreneurship with the entrepreneur, as entrepreneurship theories often do, or all do. We equate entrepreneurship with real entangled practices, which is where the theorizing can kind of end in a way. So this means we can attend to different dimensions of practices. We can look at things that people have never looked at before in entrepreneurship scholarship, the role of materials, the interaction order, explaining interaction order, where language actually plays a role in the discursive kind of sense, and also shine a new light on emotions and affective aspects. And I think another benefit is that EAP is actually authentically new. It's not shuffling some words around to make a new theory. It's not doing something that's been done, but we're just kind of trying to build on top of it. EAP is actually doing something really authentically new. And I think that really means the community practice plays an extra role. So there's just a whole bunch of new ways to research. The next one I think is we can also talk with practitioners and not just about them. We haven't done this so much in the community so far with EAP, but there's a huge opportunity here. If you're studying real practices that people are engaged in, sometimes they're not aware that they're engaged in these practices, sometimes they are. You can talk with people about this stuff, be reflexive with them, and people can resonate. They can see themselves in the videos, for example, and they can say, this is what we were actually doing. This is a very helpful thing for practitioners as well as for researchers. And EAP is also quite flexible. It's not a theory in the traditional positivist sense of a theory. We have different lenses available to us, ethnomethodology, Schatzian theories, Bourdieu, many others. There's a flexibility in lenses that you can use in order to go in and really investigate empirical phenomena that we have never really looked at before. This is a huge opportunity. And this brings with it new methodologies that haven't really been explored before. So what's the challenges of EAP? The challenge is that we can call a study a practice-based study, but still have really no practice at the core of the study. So this is a challenge because we're all finding our way, and it can be quite difficult to figure out this new way of doing research and what are we actually looking at, et cetera, and how does this fit with certain phenomena or topics that are being written about. But I think as a rule of thumb, if real practices aren't the unit of analysis, then or a starting point, then you're probably not doing a practice-based paper. We can talk about that tomorrow for sure. Another challenge is we're not doing traditional theory building or theory testing kind of research that we're all taught when we do PhD and I guess a master's as well. EAP is kind of just a lens to get started. So you just put on these glasses and you say, this is a justification for why I'm going to study practices. And this is now my entry to the field. That's where EAP helps you get towards. It is a non-traditional theory building exercise. It could be later if we congeal around certain practices that are, let's say, quite common or identifiable, and we can build theory around certain practices to a certain extent. But right now we're not there. Right now it's just a lens in order to motivate people to go into the field and study practices. So arguing in a traditional sense for a theoretical contribution is quite a challenge. All right, and the openness of EAP makes systematic and synergies difficult. There's a lot of different kinds of practice theories. The fluency people need to have in order to communicate with each other is quite high. So this is another reason why we try to have these kind of discussions. And entrepreneurship is a really diverse phenomenon. I mean, there's all different kinds of things going on in entrepreneurship. What is entrepreneurship? If you think about in terms of practices, there's all these different kinds of practices that are available to study, which is both a strength, because everything is now studyable, but also it's a challenge because where do we make these synergies? Where do we start building off of each other? Where do articles have a orientation to citations and things like that? So here's some opportunities. Advances in EAP are unlikely to come from direct borrowing from, I put XAP because there's organization is practice, leadership is practice, strategy is practice. I just put XAP. It's unlikely to come from borrowing in a traditional sense, like in a positivist theory, you would read about institutional theory, and you would take that into your realm and build new theory that contributes to institutional theory or testing institutional theory, for example. SAP is working with practice theories as well, which means that just taking studies that have used practice theories into yours isn't necessarily going to lead you anywhere. It's not going to necessarily mean you can build on top of their study, for example, because they're using the same lens. That also means that empirical studies can be quite situated and sticky, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Some opportunities too are advances come from sharing basic building blocks. So we all share a vocabulary. Oh. We share a vocabulary. I'll just go on. Right, advances come from sharing basic building blocks. So we share this onto-epistemological approach with each other. So we share a vocabulary. We can read practice theories, we can share the idea of what practice theories are. We have a certain sensitivity to empirical objects that we're shared. And then a methodological orientation we can also share. But how do we advance? It's kind of a key point, so it's kind of, there we go. How do we advance? Now it's like Saturday Night Live. So how do we advance? What's opportunities for EAP? The final point is when we look at empirical phenomena as practices, so real practices that are people doing, we can build on these empirical findings. So the question you can ask yourself is, how does this look in my context? If a certain practice or practices explain some kind of interaction order or entrepreneurial phenomenon, you can think, that's really interesting empirical context. How does this work in my context? Is this the same? Are the same materials used the same way? Are the same people acting in different ways? And then why not? Why is it different? Those are ways that we can make new progress. Okay. So the last point for opportunities is, where does opportunities for developing EAP come from? So if we're just a lens and we're not a traditional theory. So I was talking about opportunities with EAP. And I just mentioned that advances can be made because we share this ontological, epistemological framework called practice theory. So we have the same vocabulary, we share an orientation towards social phenomenon, we understand the role of practices. We also have methodological implications from practice theory, so we can share the same types of methods. These kinds are room for advances because we have a lot in common to begin with. And then advances really come from findings. So doing empirical work, looking at practices, explaining phenomenon in terms of practices or entanglements of practices, gets you interesting bits about situated and sticky phenomenon that others can look and ask themselves, how does this look in my context? This study does a really good job of explaining how a startup weekend worked and to what effect on the basis of practices and analyzing real practices of people's actual doings, using maybe video ethnography, for example. People can read a study like this and say, that's really interesting. How does a startup weekend look in my country or my hometown? What are the ways in which the situation is the same? It's being produced by very similar types of practices. And what are the very big differences? And there's probably a lot of differences, so there's a lot to explore there. So you can see that I think we join together in terms of findings, in terms of building on top of these real empirical studies to see what things look like in different places. This is much more akin to what social scientists do in other disciplines that aren't so theory-oriented. Let's say, let's take archaeology, for example. In archaeology, very little theory in the front end of a paper, if you've ever read an archaeology paper. They'll go in and they'll study storage practices of some ancient peoples in the Inca Empire at a certain time. They'll really do the research, empirical research, show that this storage practice really exists, how it worked, how it influenced the community, or how they think it influenced the community. That's the end of their paper. They may add, this adds to our knowledge about the Inca Empire or how people lived during the Inca times. This is it. It's up to other scholars to look at that research and go, wow, look, these ancient peoples have these storage practices here. We also find these also in the Aztec era. Look at how they're different, the roles that they played in those societies. This is the kind of social science that I think practice theories kind of leads us towards. I know this is quite controversial because if you really take this on board, this is not at all what we read in entrepreneurship scholarship nowadays or currently. When we read entrepreneurship scholarship, it's what are you building theory about and how are you adding to theory? This is what we're taught. This is what we're told. And I think the big challenge, it's also an opportunity for EAP to try to, let's say, cut through this a little bit, use the ontological, epistemological framework to study practices, and then build on top of these kinds of findings. So EAP can capitalize on new research possibilities. We can really use these multimodal research methods, video ethnographies, cameras, Google Glasses, anything to capture actual interaction of people as they're doing entrepreneurial practices. EAP opens up a whole bunch of new lines of inquiry that are hitherto untouched, such as how does such and such practice or practices reproduce? How do they disappear? Why do they disappear? How do they travel to different places? How do they join together with other practices for some reasons? How are those entangled in those nexus of practices involved in explaining some entrepreneurial phenomena? And finally, EAP can study connection between practices. What joins these practices together? What are those implications? This is the orientation towards trying to explain larger phenomenon. Larger phenomenon as in just explaining a venture from idea to a few years down the road, some organization or some larger organization is quite a very complex process of different practices. Really diving in there and understanding that it can lead to a lot of interesting insights. So another thing that's completely untouched at this point is also within strategies practice and anybody else in management and organization studies doing practice theories is investigating change in order, looking at the entanglements of different practices that create order, so interaction order, social order, and also change. So entanglements in practices can also lead to change. I think that's a fundamental point. It's not just that practices and entanglements of practices lead to some order or existing social structure. They can also change those structures. EAP also fundamentally allows you to read far outside business and management studies, far outside entrepreneurship, and relate to other scholarship because we share the same orientation towards practices. I think this is great. For myself, reading other disciplines, sociology's been doing, and anthropology's been doing practice-oriented research for a really long time. Getting outside of business and management, reading wider, has really opened my eyes to what kind of new social science people are capable of doing with this perspective. Environmental science has picked up practice theories, geography, education, a lot of different disciplines use practice theories. Again, it's just a lens, so it's a starting point, and then they dive in and they look at how practices work, and I think it's a really good motivation. This allows us to really make new collaborations also with these scholars, putting together research collaborations across disciplines, but also across divisions within the academy. So working with people in strategy, working with people in organization studies, allows us to do this because we share the same orientation towards practice. And then again, publishing opportunities. I think we're all publishing, we're all scholars. A big part of EAP is it opens the doors for a whole bunch of new ways to start publishing papers. This is why we started Community of Practice. We started this so we could also develop this space. That means that we create publishing opportunities. There's a research handbook, Entrepreneurship is Practice, for example, that we're actually calling for papers now. I'll talk about that more throughout the conference, but we're taking papers this summer. We're going to develop this research handbook. I think it's a great opportunity for new scholars or any kind of scholar to jump in and add something to the conversation. We have special issues and further things coming down the road. So it also can pay off in a way that is also helpful for your career. Okay, that's it for me from now. Thank you very much. I think how it's going to work is Bruce is going to talk now, and then afterwards we'll just do a question and answer together, both of us, freestyle. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. We want to thank Audencia for hosting this year. It's been a wonderful period working with Claire and with Maruna and with the entire team getting this year ready to go. And I think one of the interesting things that I think both Neil and I are kind of going through this year is that personal evolution with entrepreneurship as practice as we spend time in this subject in this field, where if you go back a couple of years, we probably spent more of our time talking about what others said, and we're both going through this period where we're starting to fuse the literature with our own experiences, our own points of view, and you're going to hear that come out. One of the important things to remember in this field is that it is a pluralistic field. There is not a singular practice theory. And you're going to hear that come out in the contrast between our conversations today. And it's been a wonderful journey. It goes back to end of 2013, beginning of 2014 that we started talking about the process of putting this together. And then we had EAP1 in Amsterdam, and it's grown ever since. So I'm going to kind of build from where Neil left off, and in focusing on fundamentals, focus more on how the fundamentals relate to the kinds of contributions we can make in the field. And you're going to notice that there are some areas where we make different assumptions about the field and about what we're reading. And that includes even in the flat ontology spectrum, where, for me, flat ontologies are defined by the equivalence of object status, whether real or imagined, but they don't imply a lack of hierarchical units that we can study. So we're going to go through and talk, and I've tried to relate to some degree my own research over the last 3 years to what I read and pull out of the field and observe as I go. The material that I'm relating today is core. It's certainly not the whole chapter, but is core to the sets of conclusions that Bill and I are drafting in a chapter that will come out in our research handbook on entrepreneurial behavior, practice, and processes later this year. So my purpose is to try to incite or inspire conversation around the fundamental ideas and challenges that we need to work with as entrepreneurship as practice scholars, and the ways that managing those challenges can lead us to contributions, because this field is wide open with opportunities for us at this stage. Historical overview and detailed contrast of practices, we don't have enough time for that within this setting. So I'm going to keep things fairly narrow and focused and only give examples of things to kind of highlight where the notions come from. But the debates and discussions are far too broad for just 20 minutes. A little bit of my own research background. So along with working theoretically with entrepreneurship as practice over this last few years, I have been embedded in multiple field sites now for 36 months. In fact, I just hit the 36-month mark on my first of the sites. I've got 7 or 8 sites going at this point, the most recent of which is about 4 months old. The oldest of the sites is an angel investing network. And interestingly enough, and this is one of the fun things about entrepreneurship as practice, is that we become observers and participants in the practices that we are seeking to understand. And one of the things I've found is that my job, or my many jobs, are what provide access to those practices. So as the director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at Eastern Washington University, I get asked to participate in a lot of practice spaces related to entrepreneurship. And that has granted me the access as a participant observer to be in the presence of a lot of these practices as they occur over time. And so I do encourage you to be opportunistic with your career opportunities in terms of how they open things up. And a lot of what I have found is simply starting conversations with people who are as enthusiastic about the entrepreneurial ecosystem space that you're in as you are. Gets you invited into a lot of spaces on that basis, which provides a lot of observational access. One of the things that Neil and I and Orla and Karen and all of us heavily agree on is that practice theory is laden with a lot of specific terms. And if you're going to successfully contribute in this field, you need to understand those terms. And you need to specify them clearly. And that is not only so that people can understand the contribution that you intend to make within this pluralistic space, but also so that reviewers and editors can understand how to position your work within the review space. And so we've got terms like flat ontology, individualism, holism, practice, social order, etc., that are all terms, and based on the space that you choose to come from, you need to define those terms consistent with that space so that people can position your contribution. Practice theory becomes particularly challenging because there are not a lot of agreed upon spaces. There's a lot of variety in terms of perspective. And so knowing where you fit in terms of that distribution is really important in positioning your work. Schottky offers several examples to build intuition in terms of where practices come from and this notion of doing. But he offers negotiation practices, political practices, cooking practices, banking practices, recreation practices, etc. Nicolini has studied telemedicine. I study pitching practices and investor relation practices, etc., with entrepreneurs. And Schottky uses this to motivate his intuition that practices are bundles of activities. And whereas there are a lot of specifics that tend to vary across the practice spectrum, this notion of bundled activities within practices tends to be pretty consistent across scholars. So if we know what practice is, then we need to think about what an entrepreneurial practice is. And an entrepreneurial practice, by definition, is going to be something that occurs or relates to entrepreneurship. And so if we go back to Bill's early work, he has defined entrepreneurship as the creation of new organizations or organization creation. More recently, Ahmad and Seymour have suggested that entrepreneurial activities always relate to identification of either new products, processes, or markets, which is kind of a broad casting. And the idea is that for us, entrepreneurship as practice or entrepreneurial practices are those practices that in some way relate to the entrepreneurial field or the act of entrepreneuring. And I think that most of us take a pretty broad perspective on those relations because of the ways that practices influence each other. So bringing these two ideas together, we can look at entrepreneurial practices as nexus of actions that are related in some way to the identification of new products, processes, or markets in a broadly inclusive way. Once we've got that space carved out, then it's a matter of looking at where the opportunities for contribution come from. And there are a lot of spaces that can emerge from. Initially, we can start with the debates that exist in the field and participating within those debates. How can you contribute to shaking out that conversation? So some scholars argue that non-human entities are part of social practices. And we see that in Nicolini's book, for instance. Schottky takes the opposite point. He says that non-human is not part of social practice. It's part of social orders because, in Schottky's view, social practices purely involve social interactions between human beings. So for Schottky, he excludes the non-human within that. It doesn't mean he doesn't believe it's important or influential in the practice. He does not include it. Now, Schottky, being a philosopher by practice, is aiming at clear, logical distinctions between units of analysis within his theory, and so that's his perspective and focus. While these are semantic differences, they are important differences, and if you're going to participate from a Schotskian perspective, for instance, you need to understand the boundaries that he defines within his theory, whereas there are other perspectives that are going to include non-human in different ways. In fact, for those of you who attended last year in Bucksha, Karen Verdun did a wonderful talk on the physical spaces and how they affect the nature of practice. Another example in terms of where assumptions come into play and where we can carve out how these assumptions play into entrepreneurship's practice. Some scholars take the extreme assumption that all human activity is social, therefore subsumed under practice. Again, Schottky becomes a counterexample in that he recognizes the socialness side of interaction and the individualness side of interaction, the terms that he uses to separate the individual space from the social space. And in this way, what we see are within the debates of entrepreneurship's practice, these differences. It's not that one side is wrong or right, it's that there is still debate in terms of idea and term, and you need to be consistent with where you fit within that space. So my take on it is that we have this broadly inclusive opportunity for participating within the practice space. My take as a reviewer or as an editor is I'm not going to tell you that your take on practice is wrong unless you are inconsistent with the entrepreneurship as practice space that you claim to be contributing within. I also strongly agree with Neil. Don't make up your own practice theory. We have plenty of them already. That doesn't mean that you can't extend or clarify practice theory. If we go back philosophically, Wittgenstein made an entire career out of clarifying concepts. And there is still plenty of opportunity for that. That's one of the reasons for pointing out these debates and the importance of these terms. One of the other questions that comes up is identity part of the subject in the Descartes and Kant way, or is it formed only in reference to social practice? My own personal take on this is that the extreme view probably doesn't hold because I look at counterexamples. So one of the things we've got to remember is not to simply cherry pick confirming examples, but to ask ourselves in these mental experiments, what would be the contradictory test? What's the test of this idea? So for instance, did Thoreau have no identity during those 2 years that he was writing in Walden, where he was completely isolated on his own? Is Alex Honnold, if you don't know who Alex Honnold is, he is one of the famous free climbers in the world. And because of the risk of the activity he participates in, most of his major free climbs have been done completely solo without telling anybody about them. But I would suggest that he still has an identity as a climber during those times in spite of being completely isolated on his own, and there's numerous examples. So I then come back and looking at this and suggest that perhaps the way of looking at it is that practices serve to help craft new identities and to make salient identities that are part of individuals' existing repertoires. And I know that in my personal research, when I am in the angel investing space, for instance, I find different identities being activated at different times within that same practice space, even though I'm the same person within it. And so there's a certain intuition here. I haven't played with this a great deal, but I think that there may be a hybrid or an interactive play between those two endpoints that may be interesting. We need to know critical terms that come up frequently in, not necessarily within practice theory, but that you'll be faced with or confronted with in defending your positions in practice theory. So for instance, individualism versus holism are two ends that really neither one applies to good practice theory research, but we need to know what they mean because it's amazing how often reviewers will come back to you suggesting that a choice you've made in your research means that you have moved to the individualistic end of the research spectrum. So individualism or utilitarianism per Parsons, same concept, different word, strictly speaking, means to understand the world as being composed of the social individuals themselves with no higher or emergent properties. So everything is explained by the interactions of the individuals. And this is really common in things like economic theory, where for purposes of solvable equations, they make assumptions about individual actors and higher order interaction terms or emergent terms would be problematic. So if you look at the work by Schumpeter and Kerzner, their work really isn't about entrepreneurs or entrepreneurship, it's about economic theory and relaxing assumptions. And for their work to progress, they need to function based on an individualistic perspective or assumption. Individualism, however, does not refer to the fact that you have at some point observed or specifically documented individual behaviors within the practice. And Niccolini's telemedicine case is a great example of in which you see a lot of documentation of what specific nurses or specific doctors have done. What separates it as a practice theory piece of research is that all of that evidence lends insight to the practice. And that goes back to where Neil started. Practice theory research, in my mind, is research in which the ultimate informing is about understanding the practice, not about understanding that other unit of analysis. Not that those aren't interesting in their own right. They just move away from what practice theory research is. Holism is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum in that the whole defines, so the whole is more than the sum of the parts, but the whole tends to define and specify the properties and meanings of all of the individual subcomponents. And again, that's not consistent with entrepreneurship as practice research either, but these are terms that you need to understand and be fluent with because of the conversations that you're ultimately going to engage in positioning your work as you interact with reviewers and editors. Opportunities, and Neil brought this up earlier, we have this wonderful opportunity as entrepreneurship as practice scholars to read from other fields, to learn from other fields. And so I have PhDs in emphasis of IO psychology and also in sociology. And so I have a lot of fun with the mental realm and neuroscience realm. Back in Bordeaux's time and Wittgenstein's time, there was a lot of curiosity about the nature of mind. What was the mind and how did it interact with our experience? And at that point in time, they didn't have the more sophisticated tools that we have today to understand some of the causal underlying mechanisms of how mind and brain work and how they relate to the body and the body-mind interactions. So they had no choice but to use inference. Now, both individuals, Bordeaux and Wittgenstein, read heavily in the literatures about mind, but they had no choice but to draw on inference. So Bordeaux gives the example, page 81, 82, of a player who is involved and caught up in the game, adjusts not to what he sees, but to what he foresees in advance in the directly perceived present. He passes the ball not to the spot where his teammate is, but to the spot he will reach before his opponent a moment later, anticipating the anticipations of the others, and when selling a dummy, seeking to confound them. Okay, so at this point in time, this was evidence, or seemed to be inferential evidence, that there was this non-conscious element of reaction, which is actually the term that Wittgenstein used for the same concept. However, now, if we go reading in other literatures, a lot of these concepts are exceptionally well understood. We no longer need to rely on the same level of inference. So we need to embrace the model of these scholars by continuing to reach across intellectual boundaries to test and build upon the ideas that inform what we're doing. So for now, 40 years of research and expert skill research by Erickson and his colleagues. We have a deep understanding of neuroplasticity and trained modification of neural systems from Merzenich and colleagues. Erickson at Florida State, Merzenich at University of California, San Francisco. We've got a deep understanding of the principles of Bayesian inference used by the brain to interpret external cues. That's Ramachandran and his team down at University of California, San Diego. And a lot of information about the relation between conscious and subconscious learning and decision-making with the two-system theory, C system and X system, by Lieberman and his colleagues down at UCLA. The idea being that when Bordeaux was drawing his inferences, when Wittgenstein was drawing his inferences, that was the best that they could do at that point in time. But we now have information that makes those same questions readily apparent and well understood. It's our job as entrepreneurship as practice scholars to seek out that additional information that can inform and better shape what we understand about these practices. And so one area of contribution to EAP is being that boundary spanning scholar, that person who likes to play between fields and to bring concepts together and to bring concepts forward in time. And that doesn't mean we're invalidating everything that comes before us. It means that we're building on it and helping shape it with new information. And we need reviewers and editors to embrace that that is a valuable contribution in our field that helps shape us in terms of moving forward. Another opportunity is for us to specifically build practice expertise, and I'm going to tie this into Bengt Johansson's arguments on enactive theory, or on enactive research. But for anybody here who watches sports of any sort of type played at an exceptionally high level, there's typically commentators these days, color commentators, who share insights on the nuances of the activity that's being performed. And so one of the questions we can ask ourselves in terms of mental experiment is, who would pick up more nuances of the action? Somebody who has years and years of expert training in that particular activity, a quarterback in professional football, a former professional soccer player in World Cup, etc., or somebody who has watched it for 20 hours. And that's one of the comparisons that we can draw in our research. So one of the ways that we can contribute to EAP research is by becoming a practice expert, investing the time to become essentially a practice specialist. And so one of the ways of kind of framing this out is we can look at a lot of the research that occurs in EAP in terms of the number of cases, number of separate cases of practice that are studied against the number of hours that are spent with the practice. And so when we look at an active research, we're looking at the extreme circumstance of a single case where you are the entrepreneur in that instance, and you're spending hundreds and perhaps thousands of hours with that specific set of practices. If we look at Nicolini's telemedicine example, he's looking at a bundle of narrowly collected practices and perhaps not spending as much time with each, but spending a lot of time in the field with them. Our recent study in terms of the field of pitching to angels, or the practice of pitching to angels, we had lots of cases. I believe at the time of the ERD submission, we had 28 or 32 cases. We're now up to 37 cases that we've documented. A few of those have just been added over the last couple of months. We've spent 36 months in the same field site observing the multiple cases. And so the idea is that by investing that time, we as practice scholars can actually become experts in the specific practice. Not that everybody needs to, but it's another area of contribution that has potential for us. So what I tried to do was summarize the variety of contributions that kind of fall out of this dialogue. So we can look at single practice, single case, where scholars help build a library of thick descriptions of entrepreneurial practices. We can look at single practice, multiple case, again, contributing to that library of thick descriptions. But here we also have the ability to tease out variation across either practice spaces or practitioners. Multiple related practices, so looking at these nexuses of practice and how they relate to one another or influence one another. If we look at Nicolini's book, Chapter 9 is fabulous in terms of suggesting opportunities. So zooming out, looking at how higher levels can influence or shape the practices. Zooming in, specific elaboration of one or more sub-elements of the practice and placing the focus on there. We can contribute by developing concepts and assumptions, in this sense following the Wittgenstein kind of model of really focusing on teasing out, shaping, and expanding concepts. And we can also look at the interplay between EAP findings and those of related fields, and that's where we may see something different from what other fields have seen in practice, and we can add to what they are doing. This is certainly not intended to be an exhaustive list, but what you can see is there are a lot of opportunities in this field to make contributions at this time. There are a lot of opportunities for you to carve out your piece of what entrepreneurship as practice as a community will become. And there are a lot of right ways to make those contributions. So I think we invite you all in to find your way and your space within that.